Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you to 10X Investments as well for inviting me. I must say, it is a real honor to be here. I was in South Africa last 20 years ago as a television journalist, and 1996, the very early days of the Rainbow Nation. It was a really exciting and almost kind of intoxicating place to be, and I'll always remember it, and particularly following South Africa in the African Nations Cup. And one of those kind of life memories which will always stay with me was watching, I think it's possibly the semi-final of the cup in a shebeen in Soweto, and finding myself almost cheering like a native South African. Randall, who I think we've already gathered is a bit of a football fan like myself, was telling me over dinner last night that sadly it's been rather downhill for the Bafana ever since then, but never mind. I'm going to look at the 5 questions which I feel you need to ask and find the right answer to if you're to have a successful investment experience. Now, these questions apply equally, whether you're an individual investor or an institutional investor, and regardless of how much money you invest. Now, I'd like to just a gentleman was talking about his hobby horse. A hobby horse of mine is simplicity. The industry, as Tracy was just saying there, loves complexity. In many ways, complexity is how it makes its money, how it makes its vast profits. The big secret to investing is there is no secret. Investing is remarkably simple. No, it's not easy, but simple. Those two are very different things. Simplicity beats complexity every time, so I'm going to keep this simple. So, question 1. What are your goals? And okay, fair enough, this I admit applies more to individual investors rather than to institutions. But I'm constantly surprised at how many investors just jump straight in to buying products, picking stocks and sectors without even thinking about what their goals are. How much risk do they need to take? Do they really need to take a lot of risk in the first place? How much are they able to take, and how much are they comfortable taking? So you need a plan. It's amazing how many investors don't even have a plan. And remember, although different types of strategy have been shown to work, they only work if you stick to them. So your plan has to be a plan that you can adhere to regardless of what happens. Question 2. Do you have an edge over other investors? And I urge you to be really honest with yourselves about this. And this definitely does apply to institutional investors as well. As the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman has shown, investors are remarkably overconfident. Zach was talking earlier about optimism bias. That really is a problem. I think sometimes we don't stop to think what a remarkable invention the stock market actually is. Think about it. It's like a giant brain, a supercomputer. There are millions of traders all around the world placing millions, yes, millions of trades every second of the working day. So at any moment in time, the price is the entire market's very latest, best guess estimate as to what a particular asset is worth. So remember, every time you trade, ask yourself, do I know anything that millions of people out there don't know already? Now, perhaps the biggest mistake investors make, and this includes professional investors as well, is they simply do too much. They trade too often, and each time they do, they incur costs which over time will eat away at the value of their returns. Now, Professor Terence O'Dean from the University of California at Berkeley has done some study on this. He looked at more than 10,000 brokerage accounts in the US between 1991 and 1996. And he found time and time again that the profit potential was overestimated by the individual investor or by the pension fund. Very often, the profits, the proceeds of those trades would not even, didn't even cover the costs incurred. Investors were prone to overtrade. And in fact, this had a huge impact on their end returns. Investors who traded most returned, on average in that period, 11.4%. The market returned much more, 17.9%. So let's have a look now at stock selection. Picking stocks sounds seductively easy, but it's not. And one of the problems stock pickers face is that the best companies don't always make, in fact, they usually don't make the best investments. Now, Richard Foster and Sarah Kaplan explored this issue in a book they wrote together called Creative Disruption. And they looked at the S&P 500 from 1957 to 1997. So of those original 500 constituents of the S&P 500 index, how many were still around in 1997? Just 74. Only 15% even remained on the list. An even smaller, in fact, far smaller percentage actually had outperformed the index. And they concluded in that book, searching for excellent companies was like trying to catch light beams. They were easy to imagine, but so hard to grasp. Okay, that's stock selection. The other way investors, as we know, try to beat the market is through market timing. And there's nothing more tempting nor more damaging to investment returns than trying to time the market. Now, you might know we've had a little vote where I come from a few weeks ago. And there's been all sorts of nonsense. You wouldn't believe the nonsense that's been written about Brexit and the things that investors ought to be doing or not to be doing, the sectors they ought to be getting into, the sectors they should get out of. Of course, all these big market calls only really make a positive difference if you know the outcome in advance. And of course, as we all know, most of us got the result wrong. The evidence shows that market timing is even harder than outperforming through stock selection. And we can all get it right once. Indeed, many in the industry build a whole career on making just one correct call. But remember, you need to be right on the way up and on the way down. You need to know when to get out of the market when you think, yep, it's right at the top, I'm getting out. You also then need to know when to get back in. In fact, it's even harder than that. To outperform consistently through market timing, you need to carry on being right time and time again. Professor William Sharpe, Nobel Prize-winning economist from California, did some studies on this, and in 1975 he wrote a paper about it, in which he calculated that you need 74% accuracy as a market timer to outperform a comparable passive portfolio. You need to be right about 3/4 of the time. Now, the CXO Advisory Group, which is a consultancy in America which looks at the performance of funds after particular recommendations by advisors and so on, they worked out that for the period 2000 to 2012, not a single expert, not a single market timing expert reached that 74% requirement that William Sharpe identified. So on to question 3. If you can't outperform the market, can you find somebody to do it for you? In other words, can you identify the outperforming funds of the future? Now, the number one challenge you face in trying to pick a future winner is trying to distinguish between genuine skill and simple random chance. There is, in fact, far more evidence of luck than skill in fund performance. Take, for example, this 2010 study by Barras, Skye, and Vermes. They studied the performance of just over 2,000 funds in the US between 1975 and 2006, and they found that 99.94% showed no evidence of genuine stock-picking skill. 0.6%, those were the funds who did appear to have shown that, they decided were statistically indistinguishable from zero. Challenge number 2 that investors face is that past performance does not predict future performance. It seems an obvious thing to say, but it's true. Anyone can tell you who the winners have been in the past, but identifying winners in advance is a very different proposition. The only persistent characteristic of fund performance is the chronic lack of persistence. Morningstar investigated this issue of persistence in a US study 2 years ago. They looked at the top 100 fund managers between 2002 and 2013, and only 7.8% of funds were able to repeat their performance. In other words, finish in the top 100 the following year. Even more extraordinarily, in 2008 and 2009, not a single fund managed to repeat that top 100 achievement. Now, challenge number 3 is this. How do you know that the fund you choose today is still going to be around in 25 years' time? For that matter, will it even be around in 10, even 5 years' time? Survivorship is a particularly big issue where I come from in the UK and indeed wider Europe. And earlier this year, S&P Dow Jones indices examined the durability of equity funds provided by European fund managers since 2006. 40% of sterling-denominated European equity funds survived the full 10 years. So in other words, 6 out of 10 funds actually didn't even survive that full 10 years. Only 38% of euro-denominated US equity funds survived. So on now to question 4. Okay, we've established that it's very hard for individual investors and pension fund trustees to identify star managers in advance. But are there people out there with the knowledge, skill, or expertise to spot them for you? Again, picking star fund managers before they become stars is extremely difficult. Remember first, there are oodles of funds, more funds, in fact, than individual securities. I find that an amazing fact, discussing over dinner last night. Think about it, there are more funds in South Africa than there are individual securities. It's exactly the same in the UK. It's exactly the same in the United States and elsewhere. So lots of funds and yet very few winners. Only about 1% of funds beat the market consistently over the long term. Now, one of the most comprehensive studies of UK fund performance in recent years is this study by the Pensions Institute based at Cass Business School in London. Now, Blake, Caulfield, Unitas and Tonks concluded that while star fund managers do exist, all the empirical evidence suggests they are incredibly hard to identify. Furthermore, it takes a very long time to do so. It takes 22 years, they say, of performance data for a test of a fund manager's skill to have 90% power. So in other words, it takes 22 years, typically, for you to be 90% certain that a particular fund has skill. Interestingly, I was talking to a statistician in London the other day who was actually saying he believes 22 years is far too short a time span, and it takes far longer than that. Now, as we all know, pension fund trustees often employ investment consultants, sometimes at great expense, to recommend which funds to use. So, what is the track record of these consultants? Well, two academics, Goyle and Powell, in 2008, analysed the hiring and firing of fund managers by US pension funds in a study, and they concluded this. They looked at nearly 9,000 managers between 1994 and 2004. Now, the hired managers, in other words, the managers, the investment consultants said, hire, you need to hire these people. They had, in the previous 3 years, outperformed by 2.91%. Okay, on the advice of the consultants, the fund then hired those managers. And in the following 3 years, they then underperformed by 0.47% over the next 3 years. And to add insult to injury, the managers who were fired actually went on to outperform those who were hired. Now, one of the biggest critics of investment consultants is the most famous investor of all. Warren Buffett has consistently recommended low-cost funds, not just for individual investors, but also for institutions. And earlier this year, at a meeting of Berkshire Hathaway shareholders in Omaha, Nebraska, he said this: I've talked to huge pension funds, and I've taken them through the math, and when I leave, they go out and hire a bunch of consultants and pay them a lot of money. It's just unbelievable. So the last question. If you've answered no to 2, 3, and 4, what should you do? So you've decided you don't have an edge, you don't know who the future stars will be, and you don't know someone who knows who the future winners will be. So what then do you do? Well, more than 50 years of academic research suggests you do 3 things. The first is to keep costs low. The industry and the financial media love to talk about performance. Performance is exciting. Good investing is boring. If you want excitement, go to Sun City and play on the slot machines and visit the casinos, but don't seek excitement with your life savings. What matters is net performance. So what investors need to focus on is the cost of investing. Simply put, the less you pay to invest, the more you keep. Now, Morningstar recently published some interesting research on the link between cost and net returns. They looked at the performance of US equity funds between 2006 and 2015. And after costs, active funds overwhelmingly underperformed low-cost index funds. Worst performers of all were active funds with the highest fees. There's also a double whammy, a sting in the tail there, because high-cost funds also had a significantly lower survival rate than low-cost funds. So how can we actually visualize this impact of cost on investors? And I think this is a real challenge for us as advisors, as financial educators and so on, to get this across to people, how serious this is. Well, of course it varies from country to country, but using high-fee, actively managed funds could mean losing more than half your eventual returns. Could mean about 2/3, perhaps even more. In his book, Investing Demystified, the former hedge fund manager Lars Kroy, I'd really recommend that book incidentally, described the impact of fees and charges on a typical UK investor. And he took a tube driver earning £40,000 a year. I didn't realise it was actually so lucrative to drive a tube train. But he worked out that saving 10% of his income every year for 40 years, the difference in cost between investing actively and passively is about £300,000. I don't know anything about cars, but Lars Kroy assures me that you can actually buy 7 Porsches for that. Now, most investors will never drive a Porsche, but rest assured, plenty of people who manage their money will do. Secondly, don't forget to enjoy the one free lunch in investing. Diversifying your investments is a complete no-brainer, and yet the brainiest people, the most experienced investment committees, fail to do it properly. Diversification has 3 main benefits. It reduces, of course, your exposure to different types of investment risks. It can also improve your expected returns. And it creates a smoother ride towards your investment goals. And of course, one of the beauties of index funds is that they have inbuilt diversification within the actual fund itself. You're not trying to find a needle in a haystack. You're buying the whole haystack. The third thing, bizarrely, is possibly the hardest piece of advice to follow, and that's to do nothing. Assuming whether you're an individual investor or an institution, you have the right plan in place, the best course of action is almost invariably inaction. This is one of my favorite investment headlines. Last year, Fidelity carried out an internal audit of customer accounts in the US. And it found that investors who'd actually performed the best were those who had switched jobs and forgotten all about the old pension plan they had. And so they weren't doing any fund switches or trying to do anything clever, moving out of this and into that. The other people who'd done best were actually those who died. I'm coming to an end. And in this final section of my presentation, I'd like to look at the global picture. And one of the things that has really struck me, listening to the conversations and the questions from the audience today, is that the issues here in South Africa about cost, about performance, about transparency, about conflict of interest are exactly the same in Britain, exactly the same in North America. Through my blog, The Evidence-Based Investor, I actually communicate with people who share my approach. I call it the evidence-based investing approach. Communicate with people all over the world, so I actually have a pretty good grasp of how this type of investing is developing around the world. And the good news is that almost everywhere investing is changing, okay, albeit gradually for the better. Now, different parts of the world are going ahead at different speeds. USA is where it's at. It has clearly been the birthplace of index funds, the first index fund launched by Vanguard in 1975, so they kind of had a head start, if you like. It started very slowly. Vanguard were not particularly successful when they started in the US. We also have another big firm there, Dimensional Fund Advisors in Austin, Texas, who are also seeing some really big inflows. And you're seeing massive outflows from high-fee stock-picking funds. This was actually termed by Morningstar a few months ago, Flowmageddon. It's actually happening at a frightening rate. And very interestingly, in Canada, just over the border, fees there are higher, and there's much less awareness of fund fees and the impact of cost on investment returns. Surely that will change in the coming years. Let's have a brief look at Europe. My fellow countrymen have decided in their wisdom that the UK and Europe are two completely different things. So let's have a look at the UK first. We had a few years ago something called the Retail Distribution Review. I hear it's something that's on the way here as well. And that has really helped to focus the minds of advisors on where they add value. So in other words, they have been told that they can no longer take commission. So they've got to find out, well, they've almost, in a sense, got to reinvent themselves, work out how it is that they add value. Advisors and investment consultants don't add value through suggesting particular stocks or sectors. They add it in other ways. We also have something called the Financial Conduct Authority Asset Management Study, which is a study into competition in the active fund industry in the UK. It's due to report very soon, in the next few weeks. Really excited about the outcome of that. I'm also a member of a very exciting organisation in Britain called the Transparency Task Force. And we are a group of individuals within the industry and, like me, outside it, who want to change investing for the better. And we are starting to have a real impact in terms of changing people's opinions about the industry. We're also starting as well to work with investment committees to help them to make unconflicted and evidence-based decisions about what to do. Continental Europe, things there are happening pretty fast too. We have something called MiFID II, which is a new European directive. Thankfully, despite Brexit, Britain will still benefit from this. This is going to be great news for consumers. The Netherlands, surprisingly perhaps, is kind of leading the way in continental Europe in terms of evidence-based investing. They have a particularly forward-looking regulator there who is very keen to level the playing field between consumers and the industry. Scandinavia as well, there is a real interest in evidence-based investing. Germany too, France less so. In fact, really France is still quite a long way behind. I think it's fair to say of Germany and France, both those countries are still very much dominated by the big banks. And then you've got what I would call the third wave. Australia, New Zealand, starting to come on board now. In Asia, there's very much, as some of you may know, a kind of gambling culture. And so in many ways, Asian investors have always been very drawn to, how shall we say, high conviction active fund managers. But the people who are starting to make inroads there for evidence-based investing tell me that things are starting to change, particularly among the younger generation. And of course, here in Africa, things are changing too. You can see the excellent work that 10x Investments is doing in giving investors a fairer deal. Probably of all the continents in the world, South America is actually the furthest behind. Chile has the dubious distinction of being the highest charging fund management country in the world. I'm told that stock pickers in Santiago typically, on average, charge a basic 4.5%, and that is even before transaction costs and other fees. The evidence, you can't hold it back. Things are changing. You know, conferences like this, the success of companies like 10X shows that things are changing, and I'm sure eventually that even those stock pickers in Chile will have their comeuppance eventually. Thank you very much for listening.